Are you ready to make a career change? Is cannabis your passion? Find the right job at a great cannabis company today with a free account at Vanks.com. Vanks has spent years developing relationships with the world's top cannabis companies, so whether you're looking for a temporary gig at major festivals like Outside Lands or a C-level position with a large MSO, Vanks makes it easy. Simply upload your resume and credentials at Vanks.com to connect with companies directly, or talk to one of their expert recruiters. It's all free through the Vanks platform. So what are you waiting for? Get the career you've always wanted by signing up for your free account at Vanks.com. That's VANGST.com, and learn why so many people are proud to work in cannabis.
And basically, we build on what Minnesota has boldly as a state codified in their own state laws and start to open up other states doing the same thing. Beverages should very quickly be, $10 billion. They could be $40 billion in a couple of years and be competing with the rest of the industry.
This is The Dime. Dive into the cannabis and hemp industry through trends, insights, predictions, and tangents.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of The Dime. I'm Brian Fields, and with me, as always, is Kellen Finney. And this week, we've got a very special guest, Adam Terry, co-founder and CEO of CanTrip Seltzers. Adam, thanks for taking the time. How are you doing today?
I am doing great, Brian. Thank you for having me on The Dime today.
We're excited to dive in. Kellen, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Really excited to talk to Adam, learn a little bit more about Cannabis Beverages. And how are you doing, Brian?
I'm doing well. And Adam, for your location, please, East Coast or West Coast?
East Coast.
Let the record say, Kellen. Another one.
Another one. It's all right. We got to educate
the only place where cannabis is important.
Wow. we're
a bold statement. I like it. Coming out firing.
Certainly clipping that. So, Adam, for our listeners that are unfamiliar about you, can you give a little background about yourself?
So I've been in the cannabis industry since early 2015. I have a background in engineering and product design, and it's basically been my whole career post-college, focusing on cannabis products. Spent a couple of years extracting a lot of oil in California, and then I've spent more years back on the East Coast in Massachusetts, working with MSOs, designing labs, designing products, and then eventually creating my own product back in mid-2020, and that's where we get to CanTrip.
Any hesitations early on to get into cannabis? Was it something you knew you always wanted to be involved with?
If you want to go really back in my cannabis career, I started consuming cannabis in high school, and then I joined the pot club at UMass. When I went to UMass Amherst, which had one of the oldest cannabis activist organizations in the country. It was the oldest club on campus at UMass when I was there. And they threw a big festival every year for it. So I always thought that it was going to be something I could never put on my resume. I did not expect to go into cannabis professionally. I wasn't sure where I'd end up professionally. And then I moved to California. And when I was in California, it seemed there was a big need for engineers who were willing to take the risk of going into cannabis. So there really wasn't any hesitation. I just kind of jumped straight into it. Really not that many regrets, other than I probably can't get a job outside cannabis at this point, but we'll see. I don't think I do, hopefully.
When you're going through kind of these product developments, what made you settle on a beverage?
That's a funny question, because we were just talking about headset before the recording started, and in 2018 and 2019, I was adamantly against beverages, because as someone who worked for a multi-state operator whose job it was to design everything downstream of the flower, my position was always, there's no way we can fit a beverage facility inside this vertically operated facility. Usually at that time, they were giving us maybe 5% of the total footprint for manufacturing operations, usually something like 500 to 1,000 square feet in some of these smaller MSOs. So I said, why would we dedicate, a good chunk of our footprint to what's going to be, 0.5% to 1% of our revenue, and it's going to be the lowest margin product we make. I also went to Colorado that year in 2018, and every beverage I tried was pretty terrible. So I thought there was no way to make a good tasting beverage. And then in 2020, I decided to make a beverage myself at home. I realized this is not only possible, you can make a great tasting one. And it's really started to unlock for me when I thought about volume versus margin, because the beverage had an opportunity to get repurchasing behavior in a way that I didn't see as possible in edibles. a typical edible pack is 20 servings in Massachusetts, 10 servings in California, Colorado. And for my wife and I, we were only consuming, one gummy maybe a week, or two gummies a week between us. So it would take a couple months to get that repurchase. I thought if I could make a low dose beverage so that you would want to consume more than one in a single situation, that you could get people to repurchase more frequently. And that's really where beverage started to unlock for me. And when I started truly earnestly working on CanTrip in summer of 2020.
So you made the beverage at home, you started working on CanTrip on the side. How quickly after that did you decide this might have legs, we wanted to take on and put time and effort into this project?
Yeah, I left my previous job in early 2020 due to unrelated reasons. Mostly, there were some things going on with the company. The big ban hit us pretty hard in 2019 as a company. The company I was previously working for made most of their money off of vapor cartridges in Massachusetts. So I like to say that Charlie Baker personally killed my career. So I was pretty dedicated to it pretty quickly. It was something I really wanted to do. As somebody who's been a product developer, I really wanted to create a product of my own that I could focus on the branding and the product myself. So CanTrip was really figuring out which product I wanted to do. And I definitely had a lot of people tell me, don't bother with the beverage, go make a cartridge if you're that good at making things. But to me, it seemed the cartridge market was saturated, and there was no way I was going to sell to MSOs cartridges when they're already producing them. Now, a quick aside on that is I was very wrong on that, because that was exactly what I told Liam O'Brien at Fernway right before they launched. I was like, I don't think this is going to work because MSOs already make their cartridges. Now Fernway is like a $35 million company in one state. So I was very wrong on that. But moving into the beverage, I still saw an opportunity for something like 6 or 7 million in revenue in the first year for the beverage market in Massachusetts. No one else was online. This was before Levia launched. This was before really anybody had launched except SIP at ComCan. So I thought that the opportunity was there for the taking. So my goal was to fundraise and get to market as quickly as possible. We managed to close our first round of fundraising in March of 2021. We launched in June of 2021 using a manufacturing partner in Massachusetts. And that put us as, I think, the second or third beverage on the marketplace, right alongside Levia, High Five. And at the time, I think Can had launched one flavor in Massachusetts. And those are still the top performers in the market today. So first mover advantage is still key.
You started working as an engineer out in California, manufacturing the ingredients, and then transitioned into product development, and now you're kind of running your own business. What is that transition from like an engineering kind of technical based skill set to kind of more of a business focused mindset? Can you kind of walk us through that transition that you've been going through?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting question. Not everybody in engineering ends up moving into business from the more technical side, but engineering as a discipline really is business with a focus on understanding the science and technical aspects of business. At least that's the way I always viewed it. Certainly, you can get really complicated in the academia of different things within the discipline of chemical engineering or any other type of engineering. But at the end of the day, the way I saw it is that as an engineer, my job was to communicate what are the economics and the effectiveness of our manufacturing processes. And so focusing on things like THC recovery and the extraction process and other KPIs really put me in a position to help communicate to my bosses where we did need to spend money. And as I went further down that rabbit hole, I started to get more involved with the business end of things, and that particularly interested me. As I moved into the product development phase, the first thing you do in product development is you develop your bill of materials and you say, how much is this going to cost me to make roughly? Because you don't really want to make a product if you're not going to be able to make money on it from a retail price point. So I think product development is really when I moved into that area after kind of finishing the lab designs that I did for these MSOs was where the business really sparked for me, because product development is such a cross-functional field. I mean, you really have to be taking in the concept of, what's going to sell from marketing and sales. You have to be driving unit economics. You have to be thinking about capital spend. And so all of that really is what it takes to start a business in many ways. I think I'm a little bit light on the sales and marketing expertise, or at least I was back then. I'm a little bit more versed now. But doing all of that together really put me in a key position to understand how cannabis businesses work, what is necessary to make them work, why they're unique from other businesses, And because I had spent my entire career sort of enveloped in that rather than, having moved into it from other industries, I think it put me in a great position to be able to run a cannabis business more than any other type. And so far it's been somewhat successful.
And one of the things that you did not share were some of the obstacles that are just unique for cannabis, right? Operating a cannabis business kind of layers on different challenges. So getting started early on with CanTrip, were there unforeseen obstacles when you got started that you hadn't thought about prior that now looking back seem kind of obvious?
Certainly. I mean, in many cases, there are things you foresee, but you can't do anything about, I think is a better way to put it. Distribution costs certainly were higher than we anticipated. Having in Massachusetts, there's no third-party distributor model, or at least there wasn't, 3 years ago. We have had logistics come online in Massachusetts, but it's not the same as California, where there's a distribution license type and it's an entire business for many of these people. We really only have a couple full-fledged distributors now in Massachusetts. And even then, it's not the same thing, because in Massachusetts, they can't really buy the product from you wholesale. It's essentially consignment distribution where they can warehouse it and they can distribute it to people, but you don't get paid for the product until the dispensary pays for it. So that can cause a lot of cash flow issues, but also just the expense and the cost of it. So it's really key to have internal logistics for distribution if you're a manufacturing licensee in Massachusetts. And that, unfortunately, was not something that our first manufacturing partner had in the States. Now, I like to think that we were one of the earliest companies doing the style of manufacturing where we actually provided the equipment and the personnel and the expertise and know-how to set up these manufacturing lines inside somebody else's license, and then worked off sort of a service agreement with them, which at the time our attorney said he hadn't seen elsewhere in the States. So we were one of the early people to really be able to bring a brand that wasn't owned by a manufacturing license into the state, at least in a small and independent way. And that allowed us to remain a little bit more capital efficient in terms of our raise. It means that we didn't have to overshoot, and that really helped us get off the ground in a strong way. Where we were, I think BDSA actually had us listed as one of the top 10 retailing beverages in the entire country within 60 days of our launch.
That's incredible. Was there any other major differences between like the California market and Massachusetts market?
Between my time in California, I worked in California in 2015.
Yeah.
So the differences were myriad and almost indescribable in terms of the level. It was almost unregulated when I was out there in 2015.
It was medical, right?
Yeah, I had a med card, and we all had to have med cards.
You did have to have one.
You did. And we were operating within the parameters of the law that existed, which I'm pretty sure the regulations went as far as medical marijuana is now legal and you must have a med card and be a nonprofit. I'm not sure how much else existed. Vapor, I was making largely vapor cartridges out there for a brand that still exists. And there were no, you didn't have to test your product. We still did because frankly, it's a marketing aspect. If you want to sell your product at the time, it's who's got the highest THC results. And
you remember when they brought pesticide tests online for the first time?
I actually had already left California when they dictated that, which was a whole thing because actually it happened right after I left. So I still have many friends there who said we had to basically remove everything from our facility, scrub it down, and start over because there was pesticides on everything at the time. So I left California in October 2016. I left the state at the end of that year, but I left that job in October. So right before the election happened and Prop 64 passed. Yeah. Part of the reason I left is because I was looking at the regulations. I was looking at the facility I was working in, and I said, there's no way this company ever meets these regulations. And I believe they do at this point in time. But I think I was still largely right. Almost nobody met the regulations when they actually went into effect. And so it took years for them to start even actually trying to enforce these things because there was no BioTrack then in California. There was no metric. And it wouldn't be until I moved back to the East Coast and started working in New Hampshire that you saw BioTrack or a seed-to-sale system for the first time. But I was also one of the very few people on the East Coast at that time who actually knew how to extract cannabis professionally. And so that was one of the motivating forces in me returning to the East Coast. I really felt like an opportunity for people who knew how to extract and infuse things in a way that just didn't really exist in early 2017 in Massachusetts.
So slightly switching gears, CanTrip, what are the early flavors and how did you come up with the dosing mechanism for how much to put in each can?
Yeah, that's a good question. Early flavors, lemon, basil, ginger, peach, and grapefruit, hibiscus were what we launched with. A little insider info is that the first product I wanted to make was actually something I called Schizandra Berry Dream. Schizandra berries are these great, really tart pink berries. They're also known as the 5-flavored berry or omicha. And there's actually a local grower in Massachusetts, but the berries were very expensive. And more to the point, I don't think anybody knew what they were. So I decided to go with something a little bit more accessible to the human population. From the very beginning, I wanted to have terpenes infused in them as well. That was really important to me just for flavor purposes. I really wanted to create flavors that blended with the taste of cannabis because I had created a lot of products that were essentially, raspberry with cannabis underneath or cherry with cannabis underneath. I never felt like that was the ideal way to do blending. I was a bartender for a very long time. I like to think I have a fairly well-developed palate. So I focused on creating things I thought would blend with the taste of cannabis, and terpenes were an important part. It was really exciting to work with in a beverage. I mean, I honestly, if I did go back to bartending at some point, might start to use terpenes directly in cocktails because they have such marvelously complex flavors. You only need a tiny drop. So we like to think of it as like a garnish on the cocktail. The grapefruit was also originally grapefruit elderflower, which eventually changed to hibiscus because I like the flavor and I like the pink color. Grapefruit hibiscus continues to be one of our most popular flavors. In terms of choosing the dosing, it was originally going to be 2.5 by 2.5 in terms of THC and CBD. I really wanted a low dose product, so less than the maximum allowed in Massachusetts, which is 5 milligrams, because I want to encourage people to drink more than one in the evening to make it taste good enough that they would seek to. We all have that problem where you eat a really good cannabis infused gummy and then you want to eat more gummies, but you probably shouldn't, because you'll get way too stoned, which is why it's important to buy a bag of uninfused gummies when you do go to take a gummy, in my opinion. But the 3x2 ended up it just felt better, honestly, when trying it. And I thought it was going to be easier, basically, to hit our testing ranges with an integer than try to say like 2.5 specifically, because as anyone who's tried to do cannabis testing, particularly in the beverage space, knows, there's going to be testing variance. And so if you claim to be 2.5, but like you're 2.7, I think there's less forgiveness there than if you claim to be 3 and you're at 2.7, to be honest. So it's all in that range, which I think is perfectly kind of acceptable. And there's, I think, a 5% variance in cannabis testing is as good as you can really hope for on average. And I've seen a lot of MSOs, like data sheets, that suggest they have much wilder swings than that. But part of it is the consistency of creation. And even a bigger part of it is just the consistency of testing between different matrices. Beverage is a particularly difficult matrix to test. And so a lot of testing labs, especially in the earlier days, struggle to actually recover all the THC that's trapped inside the emulsification.
Is it challenging trying to balance the formulation of those different characteristics of the products and then have the cannabis actually highlight with all the terpenes? Is that a challenge, or based on your skill set with the background of the bartending, that was something that you were comfortable with and just easily navigated?
Yeah, it's not that hard for me to create a beverage that doesn't actually, most people don't detect any cannabis taste at all. And it's because it's blended in there. I mean, I don't know if I could create a lemon lime that wouldn't have any cannabis taste, but frankly, at the dilution levels we're talking about, we have a 12-ounce beverage that's roughly 355 grams of fluid. We're putting in 5 milligrams of cannabinoids, so that leaves you a lot of room. I will say, though, that I have tried out 50 milligram beverages with my own recipes, and you can definitely taste the cannabis a little bit stronger. But some people still don't really notice that. Some people have a really willful blindness when it comes to cannabis flavor. To be honest, I think it's people who've tried edibles more and more frequently. They get used to it and they stop noticing it. But for the most part, people don't really taste cannabis in any of the CanTrips, and that is intentional and by design. That's just something is relatively easy for me. When you spend years trying to make cocktails that don't taste like cough syrup, you start to figure out what the elements are, and it's usually keep it simple. Know how certain flavors work together, and then build from there. You can break flavor. I do something called flavor analysis when I go to make new things, where I take what I want in terms of flavor, I break it down as to what I think in terms of its tasting notes, its constituent flavors are, and I seek those flavorings and build them back up. I just did the same with the root beer, and I'm a lot more pleased with the root beer that I built from sort of like constituent flavor components than the default beer flavoring that the flavor has provided. So that's one of the things I do love best about my job is creating these things.
Is there any flavors that just absolutely don't work? Is there any flavors that just absolutely don't work?
Cherry is actually always a really difficult one, I find, to work with cannabis. I think it actually has more to do with CBD. I've talked to some food scientists about why that might be. There might be a interaction between benzaldehyde, that is a primary constituent of the cherry flavor, with cannabidiol itself. I really struggle to make a good tasting like cherry CBD, but for the most part, I haven't struggled with it as much with THC. And a lot of it has to do with dilution rates. But for the most part, you can make almost anything work. It's just, what is your tolerance for that cannabis flavor? Are you willing to blend in something, more interesting to kind of work with it? I just think generally, like using a fruit or citrus flavor on its own, you're always going to taste the cannabis below it. But adding these sort of like herbal and spice twists that we use, it blends in with that bitterness a little bit better. I would also, suggest that citric acid and tartness do a lot to sort of counteract the bitterness of cannabis. The bitterness is a very specific flavor profile. Cannabis is more than just bitter. It's got earthy tones. It's got a very specific cannabis taste to it as well. But bitterness is there, and tartness usually counteracts bitterness in a similar way that an acid counteracts a base.
To clarify, your products have THC and CBD in them?
Not all of them, but most of them do. Our original low dose line has 3 milligrams of THC and 2 milligrams of CBD. We have our higher dose line at 5 milligrams of THC in Massachusetts. And I don't know when this podcast is going to air, but by next month, we might have 50 milligram beverages out in Minnesota.
Ooh, breaking. Why was that important in the combination? Was it to try and reduce the psychoactiveness of the products, or was there another reason behind it?
Yeah, I think it creates a more social experience. I think having CBD there, what ultimately we found is that it does counteract this psychoactiveness, or at least the way that people notice psychoactiveness. And that has actually in some ways been a detriment, because people will be high and not think that they're high. This has happened with my mother-in-law, who drank one and said, I didn't feel anything, but I also never heard her stop talking for 3 hours at a time. So I'm absolutely certain it worked. And so there is definitely like less of a THC forward effect when you add that CBD, which is why for the 5 milligrams, we chose to not put additional CBD in there. And we get pretty good feedback on it. But overall, the CBD, at least from a personal standpoint, I find it a lot easier to continue to hang out with people when I have some CBD in my system. I also am a big proponent of using CBD along with THC, because I think THC works better. I also just think CBD for me doesn't have much impact unless there's THC with it.
Do you experiment with any other cannabinoids?
I'm experimenting with some for a line I'm working on that should come out next year. Definitely.
What's the biggest challenge with working with those minors? Is it the price, or is it just the different chemistry associated with it?
Yeah, I haven't even gotten into like full pricing yet, but that's almost certainly going to. I haven't found like significantly different chemistry between cannabinoids when it comes to flavors so far in several years of working with them. I was doing a different consulting project with CBG relatively recently, and I didn't notice any material impact of using a different cannabinoid. I mean, they're pretty close, like chemically speaking, and while minor, like small changes can create big effects, they don't always. And so, so far I haven't found any cannabinoid that is like particularly thorny to work with.
So when your mother-in-law mentions to you that she's not really sure if she's feeling it, that's one of the bigger challenges, right? In the low dose beverages, is that people are assuming one thing and then they experience it. And while they might be feeling it, they're unsure if they are. So how do you have that conversation to make her feel comfortable so that others that are not your mother-in-law can experiment and then continue to buy your product?
I honestly don't have a good answer to that. If I did, I'd probably sell a lot more CanTrip. The fact is, like, I think we see in Massachusetts, we had our theory of the case, which said go with low dose. I think that is validated by the biggest cannabis beverage company in the world right now, is Can, who primarily started out on these microdoses. I don't think that held in Massachusetts. Levia is still the biggest player here in the state. They only make 5 milligram beverages. And we see that as soon as we launched our first 5 milligram beverages, they started outperforming the low dose immediately. I think people want to feel like they're high. The same way if you drank beer and you didn't feel like you were getting drunk, you say something was off.
No.
And honestly, it's, as much as it's frustrating, because I do know that if someone drank the second CanTrip, they'd probably start feeling more stoned. These things are still pretty expensive overall at retail. You're talking $5 to $7 a can. So people want to feel something off more. And I think the 5 milligram dosing profile has been largely more successful in the state than the low dosing profile. And we may have to make adjustments in the future to account for that.
I don't disagree, Adam, on that. But if someone has one beer and they don't feel anything, their natural inclination is to drink a second beer, which I think is where we want people to be with the low dose beverages.
But people, like, you can go buy 3.2 beer, right? Which is lower alcohol concentration than normal beer. People don't buy 3.2 beer. They buy regular beer that has 2% more alcohol in it because they know that they're, you know what I mean? Like, people aren't going to buy the 3.2 beer. So, like, I think that, like, with beer, it's a psychological difference, right? Like, you already know that if you drink 4 beers, you're going to get drunk. That first one just didn't kick in fast enough. And, like, when you're young, you drink a couple beers, it's a completely different situation. But by the time you're, like, in your mid-20s and you've done it, been around the rodeo a couple times, it's a psychologically different experience. And I think with cannabis, because there is the prohibition, you're seeing this massive other difference, in my opinion. So I think it's trying to compare apples to oranges with cannabis and beer, because, like, consumers know that if they drink enough beer, they're going to get drunk. They don't know if they're going to get high from drinking cannabis. Because, like, my mom literally says that she can't eat enough edibles to get high, and she just doesn't eat edibles.
That is its own problem that, CanTrip faces as well, which is just some people have incredibly high thresholds, or infinite threshold. There's some people that just don't get high in edibles. But I think that's exactly right, Colin. And I think the other part of it is you buy a beer at a liquor store and it's going to cost you like $2 to $3 a can at the end of the day. And CanTrip is going to cost, most places are $5 for a lower dose and $7 for the higher dose. And it's kind of frustrating because a lot of retailers do actually charge $7 for the lower dose one, which means they're taking more than 100% markup on the wholesale price. And it also means that they're moving less velocity and people are less willing to buy a couple of them. So there's a couple of frustrations that also come along with not controlling your retailer, not controlling your retail price. We thought we could affect that through wholesale pricing, and it just really didn't move in the way that we wanted. But its scale, its points of distribution, all of those things kind of make it so that beverage is going to continue to be a really tough market in any of the regulated marijuana states until things significantly change. And I'm glad CanTrip went in when it did, because I said this when I was actually fundraising. If I can't get this online in 2021, we're not doing this, because that was, I think, still the last good opportunity to get online for beverages in Massachusetts. We'll luckily be able to ride that wave into New York State and be one of the very first people online in the regulated marijuana market there. We'll hopefully ride that wave into Connecticut and the other Northeast states. But, I see other brands coming online in Massachusetts, and, I know they exist, but they don't even register on the boards when you look at PDSA or Headset or anyone, with the exclusion of a couple powder drinks that are kind of crushing it out there. There's just only so much shelf space and only so much total addressable market. So if you don't have a chunk there, then you're going to be really struggling to carve out space.
Brian and I looked at beverages out in Colorado. I think, was it last year, Brian?
Yeah.
And it was just the exact same. What you just described was what we kind of determined from just our analysis of the market, just because it's such a mature industry that, like you just said, there's just no way to carve out your own piece after people have been sitting on those shelves for a couple of years,
There's just so many products. I was in Canada and I went to a dispensary and I opened up the fridge. I was like, where's the beverages? He pointed me to the fridge. I opened up the fridge and there was hundreds of different products. And I was like, this is the most overwhelming experience. And I just did what a very poor, simple purchaser did, is I just reached for one at eye level that was a flavor that I like and just grabbed the first one, because I was like, this is overwhelming, right? There's too many choices. Grabbed that and just left, and was like, I can't believe how many people are competing for such a tiny, tiny purchasing decision on a tiny, tiny ship. And it is extremely competitive.
It's extremely good. And it's even crazier to think that it's also one of the most difficult things to set up in a regulated cannabis license is a beverage line, because most places or cannabis facilities do not build in large amounts of storage space. They do not build in floor drains. They do not build in the kind of electric and water infrastructure that you need for these things. And it costs depending on how big you build it, but it can easily run into the millions just to get a pretty basic setup online for pretty regular volume. You can do a small scale thing for about $100,000, but to get into any sort of reasonable production quantities, you need to be spending, between $500,000 and $1 million at a minimum. And, a lot of places are going to sit down I have the same license, can make beverages and it can make vapes. So which one is going to do better for me? Even if vapes are also incredibly competitive, if beverage is just as competitive, the margin's lower, it's real tough, but vape's also a tough marketplace. You got to make your choices on how you build your menu and your facility, but that's also one of the things that drives prices up for beverages. Is it's not like I have a plethora of options to go to and I can just go to the manufacturer on the street. I mean, we had one of the biggest canning lines in the state when we started, and that was like I could basically do like 10 cases an hour. It was pretty small and slow. We were like in a corner, but we made it work. And we were nowhere near what Levy was doing, like 100 cans a minute on their line when they upgraded. I think like midway through their first year. But yeah, there's still only really like 5 successful brands, I'd say, in Massachusetts in the beverage space, and there's maybe like 3 or 4 more, and a lot more coming online that I'm hearing about. But I don't see how any of them are going to really get shelf space.
Who do you think is a targeted consumer for infused beverages?
Definitely, what we're finding is that it is a lot of people's gateway in. And Boris Jordan actually said this, I think, at Fencing It back in April, which I thought was a pretty keen insight from a man who has said some pretty wild things about beverage thereafter. But he said that people are coming in through more highly formulated products, and beverage is nothing if not one of the most highly formulated products in the cannabis space. I think that's right. It's a familiar format for people. I think overall 5 milligrams in a beverage does hit different than 5 milligrams in a regular edible. And I think it hits like softer. I think it can be as or more bioavailable, but it seems to hit differently where it doesn't like impact people as much. And this is from an array of beverages I've had with multiple infusion technologies, including my own. I find that it's generally, something like a 10 to 15 minute up. Peak at around 30 minutes and then offset between 60 and 90 minutes, even at the 5 milligram range. Sometimes it'll last a bit longer. I think that can depend on how much makes it into your liver or not. But for the most part, it seems to be a softer high. So I can drink multiple 5 milligram beverages in a day and get pretty stoned, but feel pretty fine. Whereas if I eat multiple 5 milligram gummies in a day, I'm really going to get that that hydroxy 11 THC effect. That's going to make me way too stoned. So they're a little bit safer. They're harder to screw up, I think, when it comes to your own dosing profile. I think they're just more recognizable. So people can't really focus on, they don't have to learn to smoke. They don't have to learn to vape. It always drove me nuts when I made vapes. Like people would constantly complain that it was too complicated to use when there was a button to press. It's like the button was I had to write directions, be like, press the button as you inhale. And people were like, I don't really know. That sounds a little tricky to me, as opposed to dab rigs where people are heating nails and freebasing cannabis. I digress. But I think the general that's not really a demographic, right? Like people coming into cannabis. And if I gun to my head, demographics skews towards women overall, and it's used towards honestly higher earners. I think we've seen there was an internal study by one of these companies that suggested that people who purchase beverages on average are making over $100,000 a year. People who purchase concentrates on average are making 40 or 50 grand a year. So it definitely skews towards the more wealthy, which I think tracks with the cost of these things per milligram of THC. But the demographics skews towards women and wealthier women. So I think we're going to see a lot of millennial professionals focused on these things and doing the purchasing, but also just a tremendous amount of people coming into the cannabis industry. And I think that's kind of what makes this sort of the gateway drug of cannabis.
Yeah, I agree. And it's also something that consumers are comfortable with from a inebriation standpoint, right? We were talking about beer earlier. People are comfortable drinking something out of a can that's going to inebriate them versus smoking or any other form factor. And most people don't eat an edible or eat a gummy bear or a piece of chocolate and expect to be messed up from it a couple hours later. So I think it's probably the most comfortable avenue in for most new consumers.
I mean, honestly, I don't know if this is the next topic, but this for me is the segue as to why beverages are going to continue to struggle so long as they're contained with only within dispensaries. And I think for me, it's a lot because people who might try a beverage aren't necessarily showing up to the weed store in the first place. These dispensaries really limit who's coming to get things. And it's a lot harder to sell a 5 milligram beverage to somebody who's already buying joints and dabs than it is to sell a 5 milligram beverage to somebody who might be just picking up groceries or Bud Light for the weekend. And so
That's a really good point.
Minnesota has really represented an interesting opportunity for the beverage market, and you've seen players, including CanTrip, like rush in there because the points of distribution are so much broader, and pretty immediately, stores are taking this on. We're seeing massive growth inside. There's just a gold rush going on in Minnesota right now for cannabis beverages.
You want to educate our listeners to what's going on in Minnesota that's different than Massachusetts?
Yeah. So the key to Minnesota in terms of the legal difference is that Minnesota has legalized Delta-9 THC, the same molecule that is, typically of interest in regulated marijuana markets, but derived from hemp. And the distinction between hemp and marijuana, as far as I can tell, is simply a legal distinction, having nothing to do with the actual, component genetics of the plant, other than hemp is considered anything that is grown under the hemp program, so compliant with the 2018 U.S. Farm Bill. And also having less than 0.3% of Delta-9 THC, both when it's grown and then when it's sold to a consumer. There may be nuances within there too, but essentially, if you grow hemp, you have to get rid of it if it's over 0.3% Delta-9 THC. And you can continue to process it from there. If you do, I think you get some remediation options too. I'm not that familiar with the ins and outs. But at the end of the day, now there's a program where if you can get the THC derived from hemp inside Minnesota, then you can manufacture. You don't need a special license that takes 2-3 years to get, and a Fort Knox level security system to make it. And the only two real limitations are it must be still less than 0.3% Delta-9 THC, so compliant with the Farm Bill. That's checked off pretty easily by most beverages, because most beverages are in the 1/1000% range or 1/100th when it comes to actual biomass. And then the other limitation in Minnesota is that you get up to 5 milligrams per serving or 50 milligrams per container. So those are the two matrices that you get to play by. The regulations are always pretty light in Minnesota, and what that has allowed is a pretty thriving market. So instead of, there's about 1,000 breweries in Minnesota. Minnesota's a home, like a hub for manufacturing brew and distillery equipment. It's actually where I got all of the equipment for my other business, which is distillery. All of these beverage lines can now be used for cannabis, which means they have a lot more options, which means you can get more competitive pricing, which means pricing can go down. You can also have traditional distribution. So somebody who doesn't need to spend years waiting for a license can distribute these products across the state. And so we have basically a normal 3-tiered system. As Brian, you have noted numerous times, not only in this call, but on Twitter over and over again, there's a lot of challenges in cannabis, which is why you should download the Dime Playbook. It's CPG on its own is one of the most difficult businesses there is out there. You are paying real money to make a physical product that needs to be moved to a place and sold to a consumer. When you add the cannabis challenges, everything gets that much more difficult. This is why you don't see beverages below $7 for 5 milligrams in Massachusetts unless they're on sale or in bulk pricing. In Minnesota, there's a real shot you can buy something for $4 or $5, less than $4 at the shelf, because you have all of these pre-existing channels and infrastructure you can take advantage of that almost every other business gets to take advantage of. And so that is really opening opportunity. And more importantly, a lot more people are going to be exposed to your product because you can sell it in grocery stores, liquor stores, restaurants. There's really no limitation on where you can sell it as long as the municipality hasn't banned it. You must be 21 years old to buy it, so you must still card people. But there's also some gray area, it looks like, when it comes to liquor stores themselves. Because in Minnesota, this is one of the strangest laws I've ever heard about a liquor store. In Minnesota, there's a list of things you're allowed to sell at a liquor store, which is unlike, I think, every other state where there's a list of things you can't sell at a liquor store. And cannabis is not technically on the list of things you can sell in a liquor store in Minnesota, but I think there's some gray area because you consider it a soda, you consider it other things. I don't know. The attorneys out there are honestly still kind of figuring this all out, and so is the state has. But for the moment, it's pretty lightly regulated. There will probably be more regulations in the future, but it has created this huge opportunity for beverages. And CanTrip was one of the first, if not the first, cannabis beverage that is also in a regulated marijuana market out there. Cam is also out there as well. And then almost every brewery seems to be coming up with a THC beverage now, which is interesting because I'll be back out there next week and get to try a few more of them. But most of them I have tried have not been stellar. A lot of people are not so used to working with cannabis in a beverage, and it's not the easiest thing to create a taste for. So think people are trying to figure that out right now, and that's left a lot of opportunity for people who've kind of sorted all of their stuff out already.
I mean, pretty incredible. It can be just sitting there next to like a Bud Light or a Budweiser or Michelob Ultra or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I mean, it was great to go to a bar and purchase my product at a bar. Interestingly enough, too, like the early days of California, there's some amount of self-regulation that seems to be happening. A lot of on-premise locations are restricting THC purchases to like 3 cans during a visit. So this way people aren't getting we don't have a lot of clarifying precedent around what happens if a bar gets somebody high and sends them home, they get into a car crash, right? Whereas we have specific laws in this country around what happens if you do that for alcohol. The bar is liable. So that's, one of the things that they're going to have to face. And insurance underwriters are scrambling to figure out what's going on. I talked to some different marketing companies out there, who own billboards and other media. They're like, we don't even know what to do yet because, there's other Massachusetts requires warning language on billboards and things like that. But they don't have anything for that. So it's all very new. But it's really interesting because in a lot of ways, this was kind of already legal in Minnesota, and they just kind of clarified the laws, which is one reason they passed it in the first place, was to clarify pre-existing law around how much THC you can put in a product under the Farm Bill, because the Farm Bill does allow you up to 0.3%. And if you guys are out there doing the math, a lot of edibles meet that arrangement. So there's a lot of edibles that could be sourced from hemp and sold as THC in any state that doesn't ban it. It's really unclear what's going on, but there were already existing beverages in the Minnesota marketplace before this law passed. There are already existing edibles, and if you do some Googling online, you can absolutely find right now somebody willing to ship you Delta-9 THC direct to your house. So whether or not the government decides to do anything about that is hard to say. As it stands right now, the FDA doesn't actually consider it legal to be selling CBD across state lines in food products. Because there's something called the drug preclusion rule, because Epidiolex, which is an epilepsy treatment with CBD as the active ingredient, that was passed through phase 3 trials and approved in 2018, actually, which is kind of funny. The Farm Bill passed later that year, and suddenly the question of what can you put CBD in was really unclear, because technically the FDA considers it a drug. You can't put drugs in food. You can't take Viagra and put it in a bunch of gummies and sell it, over the counter to people. Well, you could, but you probably can't. So the FDA already considers it kind of illegal to ship CBD over state lines or even derived from hemp. And Delta-9 THC would fall under the same exclusion, which is that, it's Delta-9 THC may be derived from hemp and it may hit that 0.3% standard. But there is a drug, Marinol, which exists, which would then, further debilitate these things. So the FDA actually just appointed a new person, I think, in charge of cannabis policy. I think his name is Noah Birnbaum. And he has actually some cannabis regulatory experience. So that was an interesting move when coupled with Biden's sort of pardons last week that say to me that the FDA is going to take a closer look at this. It's unclear what that's going to mean for the marketplace. It's certainly, I think, still riskier to be selling in Minnesota from a pure perspective of, the regulations could change, then your business has to change with it. But the opportunity is so great that CanTrip said it was worth it. And so did Can. It was, CanTrip is probably one of the lowest funded cannabis beverages in the regulated marijuana markets, and Can is probably the highest funded one. So we've really, I think, matched our energies here. And I appreciate Can for what they've done. They're a great brand with great marketing and some good people. So I'm really excited to be kind of in that same space alongside them.
So just to clarify, a 21 and older individual can go to a supermarket and purchase a cannabis beverage in Minnesota.
Yeah, that's correct. As long as the supermarket is willing to sell it. And we're definitely seeing convenience stores, gas stations pick this kind of stuff up. I mean, imagine any place you see a beverage, you could technically do that in Minnesota.
Do you think consumers will know, though, that these are cannabis products?
They're not, though. They're hemp products, right?
Yes, but if you consume them and you get high, will people...
Cannabis, first of all, hemp is cannabis. It's sort of squares and rectangles, right? Hemp and marijuana are both forms of cannabis.
Same, but different.
They're legal designations, right? So they should know it's cannabis. All of our packaging says in big, bold letters that there is THC in this product. There's a certain amount of self-regulation, which I think is also important by the companies themselves to say, from a public health perspective, I don't want anyone drinking this who is not prepared to drink THC. especially as, if we move into other stronger products, as you can do in Minnesota with the appropriate scoring of your servings. I don't want somebody drinking an orange soda thinking it's a regular orange soda and drinking 50 milligrams of THC. So it's pretty big and bold. And, there are debates about that because maybe the government then, that makes a bigger signal to the FDA to do something about it. But I'd rather make accurate statements about what's inside the can in the interest of my consumers. Because I don't think it looks very good for the brand either to be pushing something which is deceptive. Ours says cannabis infused. We use still warning language similar, but not identical to what we would use in Massachusetts, because we feel that it's important to, make, clear attributions to, the FDA has not approved this product. Keep this product away from children. We actually use the contains THC symbol that you see in Massachusetts directly on the can as well. It has a lot of the same designations that would indicate it is a cannabis product. We've never put big weed leaves on our product, but I think THC does a pretty good job of communicating what it is in cannabis infused. So there shouldn't be any confusion. I hope there isn't. I haven't heard any feedback about people being confused about it yet. But
are there any huge differences from a regulatory standpoint on what you need to include on the label in Minnesota versus Massachusetts?
Yeah, Minnesota has a lot less language surrounding that. The only thing that you must put on there is the dosing information. All of the same information you would put on for any food product, and the statement, keep this product away from children. You don't even have to put anything that technically, you should put what's in it, right? THC is in it, so you should put that on there. But you don't have the same, don't drive or operate a machine while under this product, or there's a lot of very long, warning language in Massachusetts that is not required in Minnesota. But we put pretty similar statements on the product in Minnesota because we do feel like those statements were generally created in the best interest of public health, and we want to comply with that.
The self-regulations and you having to interpret what you think is best just leads to so many more challenges across the industry because not everyone likely will take the same path as you. And one of the things that concerns me most just hearing this is if you're sitting at a bar, right, you take couple shots of Jameson, feeling really good and go, oh, that's Adam Terry's brand over there. I'm going to take a 50 milligram beverage. I'm going to have one of those. And the combination of alcohol and cannabis is going to lead to some other hurdles that none of us can even foresee because the combination of those is going to be altering. So, Adam, what do you think about the potential combination of those two beverages?
Yeah, it's a pretty good question. It's definitely a call that bartenders are going to have to make and servers. There's a history already existing of bartenders having to make pretty tough and discretionary calls around over-serving. I would certainly, we've been talking to our distribution partner essentially about not putting the 50 milligram beverages in on-premise locations and focusing only on off-premise locations. And that is one of the reasons for it. We just don't think it's necessary. If bars are only willing to give you 35 milligram beverages, why would they be willing to give you a 50 milligram anyway? So I think from a liability standpoint, I don't expect to see those higher dose beverages in bars. They're mostly going to be for take-homes. And an interesting thing is, so there's actually an exemption in Minnesota for the child resistant requirement for beverages. So we can use regular lids out there, which is not what we use in Massachusetts. We use those specialty XO lids. But we actually have chosen to use the XO lids specifically for the high dose products in order to ensure that they're reclosable so that people don't feel compelled to drink the whole thing in one sitting. They can actually close it. And these are special design lids that will keep it carbonated and keep it completely sealed so they can put it back in the refrigerator. So, people may not choose to self-regulate. And I don't in many scenarios, I don't see that as an advantage. There's other things around restricting yourself on marketing that I think would be a disadvantage if we hamstrung ourselves the way certain people do in Massachusetts. For example, in Massachusetts, there's a specific language that says you may not use cartoons on your packaging. And I don't know what qualifies as a cartoon, but I've seen a lot of illustrated characters on packaging in Massachusetts. None of them are Looney Tunes, but I think Lowell Smokes is a good example of this. It's literally a goat man, if I remember correctly, on the front of their package, and that seems to fly in Massachusetts. How is that a cartoon? Is it not a cartoon? I don't know. It doesn't seem that appealing to children, which I think is the most important part. I think it's probably terrifying to children, to be honest. But what is a cartoon? Can I put how far in a human depiction can I go on a label before I have crossed that step, and what is the enforcement mechanism? So, those types of things I would fear, but I'm not gonna. There are certain restrictions in Minnesota. You can't on a label, like make something that is deceptively, close to a non-cannabis product or like a well-known product. So I couldn't make something that looked really close to Coca-Cola. Another interesting point of like non-regulation is that Fireball, the brand, has a brand of gummies in the THC cannabis space, which is literally the same as a non-cannabis brand. And they just sell it. I've never seen an enforcement action against them. The product's probably pretty good, but I just wouldn't think it would be allowed to use, like, I wouldn't think Coca-Cola could show up to Massachusetts, make a Coca-Cola infused beverage, put their like normal branding on it. And, I don't think the CCC would allow that. I guess Fireball's small enough that they get away with it. But, those kind of challenges, I see it as an advantage to self-regulate. The testing regulations in Minnesota say you can't have more than trace amounts of mycotoxins and a couple other like microbial points, but it does not define what trace amounts are. So we have to define what trace amounts are. In our beverages, they're all like non-detectable amounts because it's actually pretty easy to make a clean beverage if you know what you're doing. But, regulating on the cannabinoid amounts, regulating on how batching is done, those are not super well defined in the Minnesota regulations. And so by being good actors and providing that information to our consumers, we build a brand of trust. Like, people can trust us because we're putting warning language. In fact, I think putting warning language and putting barcodes that can be well traced and putting proper nutrition facts on your label, people are so used to them that they recognize that as the right thing to do, and things look sketchy if they're not on there. So I think we actually look better by putting all that warning language on. And like, that's so true that when people make counterfeits, I saw the first like counterfeit can, like CANN, the brand, the other day, and they had all the warning language on it. Most of these places do, I guess maybe because they're trying to make it look as replicated as possible, because things look sketchy when they don't have like government warnings. Even look at your liquor bottles. Next time you pick up a liquor bottle, like there are government warnings on there that are required, and they do not look correct without them. It's just, it becomes part of the scenery.
So you think cannabis and alcohol will ever be combined? We were talking about them separate, and also, can you combine them in Minnesota based on the current regulations?
That's a good question. I don't think so. I don't know. When Massachusetts,
that 50 milligram beverage you're talking about could be a really good like mixer. You know what I mean? It sits next to the Jameson, and you just make a mixed drink with a little splash of it.
Did we just make the next Four Loko?
I did. Yeah, Four Loko famously banned. Kellen's over here trying to find any way that he can mix.
He's like, we're gonna make 6 Loko right now.
I gotta say, I'm not a big fan of mixing alcohol and cannabis beverages. I don't think they work very well together, honestly, in terms of like the effect and feeling. This is from a guy who spent a lot of his early 20s cross-faded. So it's not like I've been against it my entire career. I found particularly cannabis beverages, like they don't feel great with alcohol, like more so than like smoking itself. So I don't know. CanTrip's never going to get there. I don't think we're ever going to make it an alcohol infused thing. I don't know what the rules are in Minnesota, but to give you an example of what happened in Massachusetts, because I do have a liquor business in Massachusetts, when cannabis was legalized, the ABCC, which is the governing body of liquor in Massachusetts, sent a letter to every licensee saying you may not do not even think about whispering cannabis into your beverage. Like you cannot combine them in Massachusetts. I would expect to see that trend continued. I mean, ultimately, you can add cannabis to alcohol if you want. You just shouldn't be. I don't think you should be able to buy them in the same product. I don't think it's a very good idea, with the exception of concentrated tinctures. It is funny because tinctures, like definitionally speaking, are made of alcohol. Right. But in cannabis, people pretty quickly move to putting them into oil instead, because it's pretty tough getting that green dragon directly on the tongue. So what we call a tincture in cannabis is actually frequently not a tincture by the classic definition of it. But I digress.
What is one fact operating in the cannabis industry that would surprise or shock others? Demand
is not as good as you think it is. Like, you don't have a guaranteed demand for the product going into it. You're still as competitive in marketing. And overall, because of the restrictions on distribution and manufacturing, the demand is lower than it really should be. Like, cannabis demand in Massachusetts is roughly 1.2 billion last year. I think if you had this stuff, like at least I think edibles and beverages broadly, like if you made those freely available in liquor stores, much akin to you have in Minnesota, and then restricted, I think cannabis, flower, and concentrates basically anything that's more potent. You're basically 70% of cannabis sales right now. So vapes, concentrates, flower, actually maybe more like 80% of the overall market. Restricted that to dispensaries, but then opened up the low dose products, all your edibles, into regular distribution. I think it would have been a $3 billion market last year. I think the potential of edibles is largely untapped so long as we restrict it to these specialty places. And so demand is actually lower than people think it's going to be. It's one of the hardest things about cannabis, because we have VCs in cannabis, right? Like you guys are very familiar with Poseidon and Measure 8 and all of these other venture capitalists. Venture capital means something very different in consumer packaged goods than it does in tech. Tech has potentially infinite upside and relatively low necessity for investment. In tech, you're investing in largely labor and some sales and marketing. In consumer packaged goods, particularly cannabis, you're investing in infrastructure. You're investing in building things. You're investing in ingredients and materials. It's so much harder to do, and the return is like the potential maximum return is so much lower. The entirety of the cannabis market in the United States is something like the $40 to $50 billion range, at least the legal market. You could, I think, open that up to 200, 300 billion pretty easily if you were to open up these edibles into more broad distribution points, because people will just not go to the weed store. Like people who would normally consume cannabis, I think, basically because it was available, are not going to these specialty weed stores. They're out of the way. In many cases, even when they are convenient, it's like a whole rigmarole to get through these security places. In California and Colorado, a lot of them still look like head shops, even when there are like certain nicer stores you can go to. Most places you're going to go to are like look like a head shop, and a lot of times they have a metal detector out front because people are showing up with guns, and you have to pay all in cash. All of these things make it like a blaring signal in most people's subconscious that cannabis is still illegal. It's still something you should engage in. It's still sketchy. Until we, as a country, wake up and start putting things where they belong. And again, I do think you could have higher security levels. I think you put the weed in the weed store where the weed people go, and they will still show up. You will still sell that much flower and concentrates. But if you can open up these lower dose products that primarily it's not really your flower consumers and your more the traditional consumers going to, you would see demand skyrocket. And that is really the biggest misunderstanding people have about cannabis. It's not you just go in and demand is there. I've seen people inside cannabis who've been doing it for a few years make that mistake too, particularly those who are used to limited license states. Early days in Massachusetts, it was if you can get a product out to market, you could sell it. When I was a product developer for an MSO, I never had a quote unquote failed product because anything I could get to market would sell. But that did not apply when we tried to do some of those same products in California and Colorado. And so if you are out there thinking your demand just exists, it does not. You have to do it, and you have to do it right. And sorry, quick aside, because I know I've been going very long on this question. I had a guy reach out to me who said he wants to start a cannabis beverage business in New York, and that he has like some people that he knew in distribution. And I had to basically call this guy and be like, do not attempt to do this thing that you're about to do, because you don't even know that. Like he alluded to something indicating to me that because like I think there's like more regulations around the cannabis business than other businesses, and I was like, stop. You need to do a lot more research before you attempt to do this thing. Because he thought like there's going to be a lot of demand there. I know how to make a beverage and distribute it. I got this great food scientist, but he hadn't even read the regulation. Like realized it's just not even in the same world. Like it is a completely different world. Unless you have somebody who lives and breathes it, you will not be successful. So shout out to people who read the playbook. Hire people who have cannabis experience to start to run your business. If you're out there and you're like, I'm just going to do it and we're going to figure it out as we go, you have a much higher failure rate. So bring at least one person on your team who's been doing this for a while. There's a lot of us out there now. This industry is getting a little bit older. There's people who have entire careers in cannabis. So hire them.
I got shamed for that statement, that having someone with cannabis experience on your team is helpful, and I got shamed.
I think I saw that thread.
But hey, shout out to everyone who took that advice, and shout out to everyone who didn't take that advice and certainly wishes they did, because it's hard. It's hard. So Adam, before we do predictions, we ask all of our guests, if you could sum up your experience in a main takeaway or lesson learned to pass on to the next generation, what would it be?
I mean, pick people you want to work with. Like, if you're going to spend your time, especially if you're an entrepreneur out there and you're thinking of starting a business and you're picking, your co-founders, your first team members, CanTrip has a wonderful team full of people that are, I always think to myself, these other people who are on my team, these are the people who care about CanTrip in the world the absolute most. And if anyone's on your team, at least at the executive or founding level, that is not all in with what you're doing, it's going to be painful. So pick your partners carefully, pick your, the people who work for you carefully. People still drive everything. Everything is soft skills at the end of the day. You can be technically inclined to the ends of the earth and you will get nowhere in your career if you can't work with people. And so ultimately, develop your soft skills, develop your leadership skills, and pick who you want to work with, because you're going to spend 40 hours plus a week doing this. So you may as well like what you're doing and who you're working with.
Well said. All right, prediction time. Adam, at the Benzinga conference, Boris Jordan said, 5 to 10 years out, I think cannabis beverages will represent 50% of the industry. Adam, what needs to change for us to get to beverages being 50% of the cannabis industry?
Thank you for framing it that way, because whether or not I think that's going to happen and what we would have to do to get there are two completely different things.
Completely.
I want to know what Boris knows that I don't, because
Probably a lot if we're going to be honest.
Oh yeah, that is true. Okay, I meant about a couple specific things. Boris Jordan is a smart guy who knows a lot of things. Cureleaf is a massive organization. They've been very successful in a lot of things they've done. What I want to know that I think Boris Jordan must know is how the FDA is going to treat hemp-based cannabis. It's just what we talked about in Minnesota. But like I said, there are people who have been selling Delta 9 THC products in the United States since 2018 under the Farm Bill that are derived from hemp. They're mostly operating under the radar because they don't want to get slapped down by the FDA. The successful ones are not making specific claims about efficacy. But if you could centralize and distribute cannabis beverages, all of which are less than 0.3%, I can't think of, you'd have to have a very, very concentrated beverage. You maybe the small shots if you did 100 milligrams of THC. Even then, you might be less than 0.3%. I'd have to do the math about how small your shot can get and how concentrated. If you could do that, I definitely see cannabis beverages as being 50+% of the market, because you'll be able to get them everywhere. Imagine if Target picks this up. Imagine if Walmart picks this up. Whole Foods. Those places will never carry raw flower in there. You're never going to go to Whole Foods to the bulk section and just see cannabis that you can pick out, which would be
superfood.
Cool.
It's a superfood next to kale.
Yeah, next to kale, and they've dried out some specifically for you to eat. I think that's very possible for beverages, and I think if lawmakers are smart, and if we do this in the most logical way possible, you would allow that. And you would allow largely edibles to be out there too. You probably, I think, put those behind the counter or put them in some sort of glass case. But I think, they're not more dangerous than alcohol, which is out on shelves all the time anyway, right? And we have ways of restricting that. They're possibly safer than alcohol. And frankly, these low-dose beverages, they can do volume. And there's plenty of players out there that know how to centralize and distribute beverages nationally. So this is entirely possible. And if basically we build on what Minnesota has boldly as a state codified in their own state laws and start to open up other states doing the same thing, beverages should very quickly be, $10 billion. They could be $40 billion in a couple of years and be competing with the rest of the industry. So if he has some inside intel, Boris, reach out to me. I'm on Twitter. I'm very available. I'm sure somebody has my email address. I know that we're only 2 degrees away from each other. It's not a big industry. Let me know. We can do a deal. Cureleaf launched Endless Coast. Honestly, until this moment, I had forgotten they existed, even though they're in my own state. They seem to be doing okay, but they're also, anyway. My point being, let's work together. Let's find a way to do this. There's a lot of lobbying out there. And I think that, my view on the biggest failures of cannabis legalization have been twofold. It's been largely, we didn't really get the kind of cannabis legalization that the heaviest traditional consumers want. They're not getting the quality that they want of product. And honestly, shareholders are not really winning in cannabis right now. I mean, ask anybody who bought cannabis between 2017 and 2020, how their portfolios are doing. And they're all going to say, I'm long cannabis. 10, 20, 30 years, maybe that's helpful. But I don't know. A lot of these guys, I'm pretty sure, are going to retire before then. They're going to be taking hits on these long plays. I'm long cannabis as well, don't get me wrong. But if I bought MSOS in 2018 and still was holding on to it, I'd be in a pretty sore spot. Shout out to Rick. But at the end of the day, this is possible. We just have to do it right. And I said this on Twitter. Look at New York. If you just allowed bodega guys to sell bodega weed, you'd probably solve your social equity problem, and no one's going to die as a result of it. It's happening in New York anyway. Why don't we just legalize that? Quard has been saying that they're going to put on dispensaries by the end of this year, and Rosa Luxemburg is out there on Twitter tracking it, take minute by minute, and it just doesn't seem like it's going to happen.
It's going to happen.
I really don't think it's going to happen. And even if it does, you're talking one or two stores, as you suggested, for a photo op. And what does that do for anybody except a politician? We should have just opened up New York State and let people sell weed out of bodegas, from hemp farms.
They are doing that.
They're doing anyway. So what is the difference? It's and they're not getting arrested for it. So why is anybody showing up to Attain or any other dispensary in New York if they can get it cheaper and more conveniently from the guy that they're buying their coffee and bagel from in the morning? I mean, it's just it's absurd to me. And you know what? People are doing it in New York basically without any consequence. And I haven't heard a single story of somebody dying from marijuana use out of New York City. It can be done. It should be done. And honestly, I think we should probably just move to that system, find a way to tax and regulate that, and we would survive. Absolutely survive. It just the level of regulation we compromised with the rest of the world, the rest of the country on in order to get marijuana legalized in the first place, has been one of the biggest hindrances to actually succeeding in this industry. And, that's my biggest failures of cannabis are actual value for people out of cannabis. But, it shouldn't be, you shouldn't have to have, I'm sorry, creates something for you guys to push to people, this playbook. It shouldn't have to exist. You should be able to just go grow weed and sell it. And yet we have to go through this whole rigmarole and then pat ourselves on the back for being so cool because we could put the right amount of cameras in our dispensaries so that people could be on camera and then still not be able to use a credit card at those dispensaries. It drives me nuts. It drives me absolutely nuts. All right, rant over.
I just want to let you know, Adam, that most people use our platform to pitch mass audience about building brand awareness. You took this opportunity to go singularly focus on Boris Jordan, the chairman of Cureleaf, which I commend you, right? I have not got confirmation that he listens to this podcast, but I'll make sure to tag all of his friends here. So a big shout out to you on that one. Kellen, do you want to take a shot at how cannabis beverages would become 50% of the market?
I think I agree a lot with what Adam said in terms of accessibility. I think another thing that could be a game changer, which scientifically speaking, I think, Brian, we've got in this conversation, and I don't know if the science is there to support it, but if some miracle happens and someone's able to produce a cannabis beverage that creates similar experience as alcohol does in terms of a social experience and getting releasing more endorphins, getting you more amped up, and encouraging introverts to go have more conversations like alcohol does, then I could see cannabis beverages growing very quickly under those conditions. But those are the only conditions I see it occurring.
So you want cannabis beverages to just be alcohol?
That's exactly what I said, Brian. It's so awesome.
Okay, all right, guys.
And I was like, yeah, they invented it. It's called alcohol.
Okay, guys. Let's...
I just want alcohol without the consequences.
That's exactly what it is.
So let's take a step back and let's think about this, right? If Boris Jordan's making this statement at the conference, there's probably a reason behind it. I can't imagine he's just shooting from the hip. I mean, granted, I had no idea that they had a beverage, and based on what you said, Adam, they are not doing so well. So I'm sure that he's aware of that. But I think at the end of the day, what is necessary in order to get it to 50% is to have it outside of traditional channels, outside of dispensary channels, more into the traditional channels, exactly like you said. And how that happens is a Budweiser, a Molson, or one of these big conglomerates to go to the government and say, we are going to produce cannabis beverages. We'd like them sold at traditional retail like everyone else. Here's our money. Make this happen. And then when that happens and when it's sold alongside alcohol in supermarkets, it will absolutely explode because at the end of the day, you're right, there are differences in the consumer behavior. But at the end of the day, when you go to a backyard barbecue, most people don't want to take an edible. They want to have something in their hand from a social standpoint. So the ability to have a cannabis beverage that they can buy at a supermarket next to their high noons, they can't buy it at a liquor store. They can't buy high noons at a supermarket. They have to buy it at a liquor store. But next to a traditional Coors Light or Bud Light, will allow the unlocking of that mass consumer that everyone is seeking in order to get to that type of number.
There's plenty of supermarkets across this country where you can buy high noon right there.
Yeah, I think that's a New York thing. That's a New York thing.
It's a lot of like a blue liberal state thing where they don't allow it.
Yeah.
To be honest,
all the MAGA guys are going to come for me now.
Honestly, I think you're right about that. And the interest Endless Coast, by the way, I don't know how well they're doing. I forgot about them, but they're out there somewhere. They're out. Yeah. I believe in Curaleaf. I'm going to state that for the record. Like if PepsiCo can literally go to the government and pay them a certain amount of money to get this done, that's actually kind of devastating for our democracy.
That's how this works. That's how everything works.
I honestly hope it's not quite that simple. I think there's definitely a lot of money involved, but I think there's also a lot of rickroll involved. But yeah, PepsiCo wants to partner on this. Please, Pepsi, reach out.
Yeah.
Is that broad enough of an audience? I do want to state for the record, any beverage company who's not in cannabis wants to reach out and talk to me, you can absolutely find me. I'm very, very available on Twitter, very available through a lot of channels. I'm very easy to get in touch with. So yeah, PepsiCo, please give me a call. I'm sorry, Coca-Cola, please actually do that.
Yeah. So you know what's sexy is how much it costs Coca-Cola to make one can of Coca-Cola.
Sense.
It is like, I was like, what?
Yes, we haven't even talked about liquid death on this call. $7 million valuation.
We'll have to hold that for another one. So Adam, for our listeners, they want to get in touch, they want to buy CanTrip, where can they find you?
You can go to our website, cantripseltzer.com. Follow us on Instagram at cantripseltzer. I'm pretty available on Twitter as well. My Twitter name is hard to pronounce because I've reversed the first letter of my last name, the first letter of my first name. So it's Tid Adam Airy. But just Google Adam Terry. I'm very, very visible. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Signal if you have sketchy stuff that you want to text me about. Yeah, and we have a contact form on the website, so reach out. And if I like you enough, I'll give you my personal email address.
Awesome. Thanks for taking the time. This was fun, Adam.
Hey, thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to today's show. To check out more great cannabis podcasts, go to podconnects.com. Here's a preview of one of our other shows.
I'm Joyce Gerber, the creator and host of the award-winning podcast, The Canna Mom Show. And we are on a mission to enhance the impact women have on this industry as business professionals, healthcare providers, policy advocates, caregivers, moms, by sharing and preserving their stories of love and kindness, wisdom, and hope. I am so grateful to have found my tribe of Canna podcasters right here on PodConX, and look forward to our work of crushing the stigma around cannabis and caregivers and building this new industry together.